Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into one of the strangest and most unsettling questions we can ask about reality. Could there be moments when time does not flow the way we think it does? Moments when someone turns a corner on an ordinary street and, for a few heartbeats, finds themselves standing in another era? But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a joy to see all the places we gather from, each in our own little slice of time. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey into accidental time travelers and the mystery of time slips. And if your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it drift. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. There are stories, quiet, persistent stories, of people who did not build machines, did not step into glowing portals, did not press secret buttons. They were simply walking down a familiar street, visiting a historic garden, waiting for a train. And then something felt different. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just different. The air grows still, sound seems muffled, the light looks strangely flat, as though the world has been painted onto a backdrop. A heaviness settles in the chest, a faint dizziness. And when they look up again, the cars are gone. The pavement is cobblestone. The smell in the air is coal smoke and damp earth. The people passing by wear clothing from another century. These are called time slips. Tonight, we will not rush to believe them, and we will not rush to dismiss them either. Instead, we will walk slowly through them, through the stories, through the skepticism, and through the strange corners of physics where time itself becomes less solid than we expect. Because even if no one has ever truly stepped into another century, one thing is certain: time is not as simple as it feels when you glance at a clock before bed. And so we begin. There is a particular detail that appears again and again in reports of time slips. And it is not the horses or the old-fashioned dresses or the vanished buildings. It is the silence. People often describe an almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere before anything visual happens. A subtle stillness, as if the air has thickened, as if the world has taken a slow, careful breath and is holding it. Imagine you are walking down a street you've known for years. You pass the same bakery with the same warm smell of bread. You hear traffic in the distance. A bus sighs as it kneels at the curb. Nothing is unusual. Then without warning, something feels off. Not frightening, not yet, just slightly wrong. The sound seems dampened, like cotton pressed gently into your ears. The colours lose a bit of depth. The world looks flatter somehow, like an old photograph that has faded in the sun. You feel a weight in your chest, a strange heaviness in your limbs. Some people describe a wave of dizziness, like standing up too quickly after sitting for a long time. And then, the shift. The pavement is no longer asphalt but uneven stone. The vehicles are replaced by carriages. The smell in the air is smoke, horses and damp wool. The people moving around you are dressed in clothing from another time. They glance at you with confusion, or sometimes they do not seem to notice you at all. In many accounts, this altered scene lasts only seconds. In others, it stretches for minutes. Occasionally, people claim it lasted long enough to interact, to speak, to touch objects that should not exist anymore. And then, just as suddenly, everything returns. The bus is back. The bakery window gleams under modern electric light. Your phone vibrates in your pocket. If these experiences were rare, we might dismiss them as isolated hallucinations. but similar descriptions appear across cultures and centuries. The details differ: Roman soldiers marching through a cellar, a vanished hotel from decades past, a bustling market from the Victorian era. But the emotional pattern remains surprisingly consistent. There is often that moment of heaviness, that sense of wrongness, that eerie stillness. It is tempting to jump immediately to dramatic explanations. Wormholes, colliding universes, cracks in the fabric of space and time. But before we drift that far, it helps to linger in the experience itself. What does it mean that so many reports begin with sensory distortion? The human brain is an extraordinary prediction machine. Every second it takes in light, sound, smell and touch, and quietly constructs a seamless world for you. You're not seeing reality directly. You're seeing your brain's best model of it. Most of the time, that model is stable, reliable, comfortable. But under certain conditions, stress, fatigue, intense emotion, even subtle neurological fluctuations, that model can wobble. The brain can briefly misjudge depth. It can soften sound. It can heighten certain details while muting others. When that happens, the world can feel staged, as though you have stepped onto a set where something is slightly out of alignment. Think of the way a dream sometimes begins. You're walking in your childhood home, and everything looks almost correct. But the hallway is too long, the colours too washed out, the air too still. Your mind accepts it for a moment before questioning it. Now imagine that dreamlike distortion happening while you're fully awake. The sensation alone would be powerful, unsettling, memorable, and when the brain encounters something ambiguous, it searches for meaning. If the buildings look older, if the clothing seems antique, if the sounds feel distant, the mind may reach for the most dramatic interpretation available. I must have stepped into another time. This does not mean people are lying. Far from it. Most witnesses describe their experiences with sincerity, sometimes with lingering confusion or fear. They are not performing for an audience. They are trying to explain something that did not fit their internal model of reality. And this is where our journey becomes gentle rather than confrontational. Because instead of asking, "Did time break?" we might ask a quieter question. What happens when perception shifts so subtly that reality itself feels altered? And deeper still, why does time, of all things, feel so solid to us in the first place? You glance at a clock and trust it. You remember yesterday and assume it is gone. You imagine tomorrow and assume it has not yet arrived. Time feels like a river, flowing in one direction, carrying everything with it. But physics tells a more complicated story, one in which clocks can tick at different rates, one in which motion and gravity can stretch or compress duration, one in which, at the deepest levels, the equations describing nature do not clearly prefer a direction at all. We will move into those ideas slowly. There is no need to rush toward the strange mathematics of the universe just yet. For now, it is enough to sit with the silence before the shift. That moment when the world feels thinner, when sound fades, when the air grows heavy, and when, just for a breath or two, reality seems less solid than it did a moment before. There is something deeply human about the idea that the past is not entirely gone, not erased, not sealed away, but still somehow present, like an old room behind a thin wall, separated from us by only a layer of plaster we rarely notice. Many of the most famous time-slip stories share this quiet suggestion that history is not behind us, but beside us. In the early years of the 20th century, two educated women visiting a grand palace in France described something they could not easily explain. They had been walking through carefully manicured gardens, searching for a smaller estate tucked within the grounds. The afternoon air felt heavy, the atmosphere unusually still, no breeze, no voices, no rustling leaves. They later wrote that the light seemed oddly flat, as though the world had lost depth and shadow. The colours were muted, almost like a faded painting. Then they encountered people dressed in clothing from another century. Long coats, tri-cornered hats, old-fashioned fabrics that seemed authentic in cut and detail. They described a woman sitting quietly on the lawn, sketching, wearing a wide white hat. For a brief stretch of time, everything around them appeared to belong not to their present day, but to a moment long past. When they returned to their normal surroundings, the modern world resumed without ceremony. Tourists, noise, movement. They would later wonder whether they had somehow glimpsed a moment from the late 18th century, perhaps near the final years of a famous French queen. What makes this story linger is not the royal connection. It is the atmosphere, the stillness, the sense that reality had become stage-like, suspended, and it is not alone. In another account from mid-20th century England, a young apprentice working in a cellar described hearing a distant horn, faint at first, then louder. Confused, he paused his work. What followed was stranger still. He reported seeing soldiers emerging as though marching along a row that didn't visibly exist. Their clothing matched ancient military styles. Their lower legs were obscured, as though the ground they walked on lay below the cellar floor. The moment passed. The cellar returned to silence. Years later, excavations revealed that a Roman road had once run beneath that very building. To some, this detail feels like confirmation. To others, it feels like coincidence meeting imagination. In the city of Liverpool, stories accumulate like layers of paint. People describe walking along familiar streets only to see shop fronts replaced by older designs. Vehicles transformed into models from decades ago. Street signs shifting subtly in style. The transformation lasts seconds, sometimes a minute, then dissolves. A man turns a corner and finds himself facing a clothing store that closed decades earlier. A young woman steps into a shop selling baby clothes that supposedly no longer exists. Underground explorers hear bustling Victorian markets in tunnels that now lie empty. In one American story, a traveller enters a small diner styled perfectly like the 1960s. The glass soda bottles feel thick and heavy. The prices seem improbably low. The music hums with vintage authenticity. The next day, the building is boarded up, reportedly abandoned for decades. Each story carries similar emotional tones: curiosity, disorientation, a faint thread of fear, but also something softer, a strange sense of having brushed against a hidden layer of time. What is striking is how ordinary these settings are. No glowing portals, no laboratory accidents, no lightning storms, just streets, gardens, cellars, cafes, the ordinary becoming slightly misaligned. It is important to pause here and resist both extremes. It is easy to lean toward belief, to imagine thin spots in the fabric of time where centuries overlap like pages pressed together. It is equally easy to dismiss everything as fabrication or fantasy. Instead, let us notice something subtler. These stories often involve environments rich in history, places layered with memory, locations where imagination already has material to work with, ancient cities, historic districts, buildings that have been rebuilt and repurposed over generations. When you stand in such a place, you're surrounded by invisible context. Beneath the pavement may lie older roads. Beneath the modern facade, earlier foundations. The mind knows this, even if you do not consciously think about it. Your brain is constantly filling in gaps. It draws on stored images, cultural memory, photographs you have seen, films you have watched, stories you have heard. When sensory input becomes even slightly ambiguous, when light flattens, when sound dulls, when dizziness creeps in, the predictive machinery of the brain can reach into those archives, Imagine walking through a historic district at dusk. The light's low, the shadows stretch, the edges of buildings blur slightly. For a fleeting instant, the modern signage disappears in shadow, and your mind overlays an older version of the same street. It would not feel like imagination. It would feel like revelation. The human brain does not announce, "I am constructing this image." It presents its model as reality, and yet there is another layer to consider. Physics itself has taught us that time is not as rigid as our daily experience suggests. Clocks do not all tick at identical rates under all conditions. A clock placed higher above the Earth's surface ticks ever so slightly faster than one resting at sea level. A clock travelling at high speed ticks just a little slower than one standing still. These differences are not dramatic. They're not enough to send a pedestrian back to the 1800s. But they are measurable. Precise atomic clocks, devices that measure time using the steady rhythm of atoms, have confirmed that time stretches and compresses in subtle ways. If time can bend even slightly under the influence of motion and gravity, it plants a quiet seed of wonder. Perhaps time is less like a rigid rail and more like a flexible fabric, not tearing open on street corners but capable of curvature. This does not validate time slips. It does not prove that people are stepping between centuries. But it gently unsettles the assumption that time is simple. And that may be why these stories endure. They resonate with something deeper than spectacle. They echo a scientific truth that time is not an absolute universal metronome ticking the same for everyone everywhere. Instead, it is intertwined with space, motion, and gravity in ways that once seemed impossible. Still, we must tread carefully. The measurable bending of time in physics is small, predictable, and repeatable. Time-slip stories, by contrast, are sudden, dramatic, and personal. There is a gap between them. But gaps are interesting places. They are where imagination stretches toward explanation, and where science asks quieter questions. For now, we remain with the stories themselves, not as proof, not as illusion, but as human attempts to describe something that felt profoundly real in the moment it occurred. Because whether or not anyone has truly stepped into another century, the experience of standing in a place that feels layered with invisible history is something almost everyone has known. A castle corridor at dusk, an empty train platform, a cobblestone street after rain. Sometimes the past feels very close, close enough to touch. And in that closeness, the boundary between memory, perception, and time itself begins to soften. When you gather enough stories together, something curious begins to happen. The dramatic details may differ. Roman soldiers in one account, a vanished bookstore in another, but the emotional structure often follows the same quiet rhythm. First, normalcy. Then, a subtle disturbance. A heaviness in the chest, a pressure in the air, a stillness that feels unnatural, like the moment before a storm, except no storm arrives. Then the shift. And finally a return, sudden, clean, as though nothing ever changed. If these accounts were wildly different from one another, we might struggle to find any coherence, but they share common threads. And those threads are worth examining gently. One recurring element is isolation. Many witnesses are alone, or with only one other person. Crowds rarely confirm the same shift simultaneously. Even in cases involving two people, the recollections sometimes differ in small but meaningful ways. Another pattern is the brevity of the experience. Time slips rarely unfold over hours. They tend to last seconds, perhaps a minute or two. Long enough to feel significant, short enough to evade documentation. There is also the absence of physical trace. No artifacts are carried back. No old coins remain in a pocket. No photographs reliably capture the altered environment. The world resets. These patterns do not disprove anything outright, but they invite careful thought. If something physical were occurring, a literal overlap of centuries, we might expect physical evidence, a displaced object, a measurable disturbance, a recorded anomaly in cameras or sensors. Instead, what we find are stories, often sincere, often detailed, but stories nonetheless. And stories have their own laws. The human mind does not store memories like a video archive. It stores fragments, sensations, emotional impressions. Later, when we recall an event, the brain reconstructs the scene from those fragments. It fills in gaps, it smooths rough edges, it unconsciously adds coherence. Think of remembering a conversation from years ago. You may recall the tone, the setting, perhaps a specific sentence, but the exact words, they're often rebuilt on the spot, shaped by who you are now. Now imagine remembering something that already felt surreal when it happened. A moment when the world looked flattened and strange. A moment when dizziness crept in. A moment when anxiety sharpened perception. Memory under emotional intensity tends to feel vivid. That vividness can give a sense of certainty, even when small details shift over time. In fact, researchers studying memory have found that confidence and accuracy are not always linked. A person can feel utterly certain and still misremember specifics. This is not deception. It is simply how the brain works. There is another pattern worth noticing. Time slips often occur in places already layered with history. Ancient cities, tourist landmarks, underground tunnels, old streets with long pasts. Such locations are saturated with narrative. Even if you are not consciously thinking about it, your brain knows that beneath your feet lie earlier versions of the same place. Previous buildings, previous lives. Standing there can already create a subtle sense of temporal depth, the awareness that time has accumulated in layers. Now imagine sensory ambiguity added to that awareness. Dusk lighting, fatigue, emotional stress, a slight drop in blood pressure causing momentary dizziness. The brain, striving to interpret ambiguous input, may reach for the most compelling explanation available. The past has surfaced. We must be careful not to oversimplify. Not every unusual perception can be reduced to stress or low light. The human brain is profoundly complex, and there are still many mysteries in how it constructs reality. But pattern recognition is powerful. We are wired to detect patterns, even when none exist. This tendency helped our ancestors survive. Spotting movement in tall grass might mean predator or prey. It was safer to assume meaning than to ignore it. That same instinct operates today. When multiple stories arise from one city, the pattern strengthens itself. Liverpool becomes known for time slips. More people visit, more stories emerge, online communities gather, the narrative feeds itself. It does not require conspiracy. It requires only human imagination interacting with shared expectation. Consider how ghost stories cluster in certain houses. Once a location gains a reputation, every creak and flicker acquires significance. Ambiguity transforms into confirmation. Time slips may operate similarly, and yet there remains something compelling about the consistency of the emotional experience, the heaviness, the silence, the feeling that the world has become thinner. That phrase, thinner, appears again and again in descriptions of altered perception. It is interesting that many neurological events, including certain types of brief temporal lobe disturbances, also involve a sensation of strangeness or unreality. Some individuals report feeling detached from their surroundings, as though watching a scene rather than standing within it. Others describe moments of intense familiarity, known as déjà vécu, not merely I have seen this before, but I am reliving this. These experiences can occur in perfectly healthy people, sometimes triggered by fatigue or stress, sometimes without obvious cause. The boundary between internal perception and external world is not as rigid as we tend to assume. Think about how dreams feel while you're inside them. Entire landscapes unfold, conversations occur, emotions surge, and yet your body lies quietly in bed. When you wake, the world feels solid again. Time slips, if understood through this lens, may represent waking moments in which the brain briefly shifts into an altered interpretive mode, not asleep, not hallucinating in a dramatic sense, but processing reality through a slightly different filter. This does not eliminate the mystery, it reframes it. Instead of asking whether centuries overlapped, we might ask how fragile our perception of the present truly is. After all, your experience of now is not raw reality. It is a carefully assembled model created by neural activity. Signals travel from your eyes and ears into the brain, where they are integrated, compared, and interpreted. There is even a small delay, a fraction of a second, between events occurring and your awareness of them. Your mind stitches these fragments together so smoothly that you perceive a continuous flow. If that stitching process falters, even briefly, the fabric of the moment could feel altered. We're not concluding, we're not declaring, we're simply noticing. The stories share patterns, the brain shares patterns, and time itself, as we will soon explore more deeply, shares patterns that challenge our everyday intuition. For now, it is enough to observe that time slips follow a recognizable arc, not just in what is seen, but in how it feels. Normalcy, disturbance, shift, return. Like the soft inhale and exhale of a world that briefly forgets its rhythm and then remembers. If we're going to understand time slips gently and honestly, we must spend a little while with memory, not as a courtroom witness, not as an unreliable narrator, but as something far more interesting. Memory is not a recording device, it is closer to a painter. When something happens, your brain does not store a perfect film of the event. Instead, it saves fragments, the general layout of the scene, a few striking details, the emotional tone, the feeling in your chest, the colour of the light. Later, when you recall the event, the brain reassembles those fragments into a complete picture. It fills in missing lines, it smooths the edges, it chooses colours that make sense. And each time you remember it, the painting can change slightly. This process is not deceitful. It is efficient. If your brain stored every detail of every moment, you would be overwhelmed. Instead, it keeps what seems important and reconstructs the rest. Now imagine something unusual happens. You're walking through a familiar place, and suddenly the air feels heavy. The sounds seem distant. The world appears slightly flattened, as though depth has been reduced. You feel uneasy. Your heart rate rises. Emotion sharpens attention. The brain marks the moment as significant. When you later describe what happened, you will naturally try to make sense of it. If you noticed old architectural features, your mind may weave them into the reconstruction. If you later research the location and discover that a particular building stood there decades ago, that information may blend into your memory, not intentionally, not dishonestly, simply because memory is porous. There is a phenomenon sometimes called déjà vu, which many people experience at least once in their lives. It is the strange sensation that something happening right now has happened before. Usually it fades within seconds. You recognize that it is an illusion. There is a more intense version, sometimes described as déjà vécu, where the feeling is not merely familiarity, but a sense of reliving. It can feel deeply convincing. Researchers believe these experiences may occur when the brain systems for recognition and recall briefly misfire. The part of the brain that signals familiarity activates without the part that confirms actual memory. The result is a powerful but misplaced certainty. Now imagine standing on a historic street slightly dizzy, with sensory distortion softening the world around you. If a momentary surge of misplaced familiarity occurred at the same time, the experience could feel profoundly meaningful, not just strange, significant. Memory and perception are partners in this process. Perception delivers the raw materials, memory interprets them, and interpretation is not passive. The brain is constantly predicting what it expects to see next. When you walk down your usual street, your brain has already prepared a model of it. The bakery sign, the colour of the pavement, the sound of traffic. If the incoming sensory information does not perfectly match the prediction, perhaps because of lighting, fatigue, or emotional stress, the brain must adjust. Most of the time, this adjustment is smooth and unnoticed, but occasionally the mismatch is large enough to create a brief sense of unreality. There is even a term for the feeling that the world is slightly off, slightly dreamlike. Some describe it as derealization. It can occur during anxiety, exhaustion, or sudden stress. The environment may look distant or artificial. Colours may seem muted. Sounds may feel hollow. Importantly, people experiencing this are not disconnected from reality. They're aware something feels strange. Now, consider how easily such a sensation could merge with historical imagination. If you're standing near ancient stone walls, your mind already knows that centuries of life unfolded there. If the present moment feels thin or altered, it might not be difficult for your imagination to supply an older version of the scene. And imagination is not a separate faculty that announces itself. It blends seamlessly into perception. We must tread carefully here. This does not mean every time slip account is simply a neurological event. The human brain is astonishingly complex, and much remains unknown. But we do know that memory changes with retelling. When two people share an unusual experience, they often discuss it afterward. In doing so, they influence one another's recollections. One might say, "Did you see the woman in the white hat?" The other, uncertain, might begin to incorporate that detail. Over weeks, months, and years, the story can stabilize into a shared narrative. That narrative can feel solid, unshakable, and if the story is later written down and revised, additional research might add context. Dates may shift slightly to align with historical records. Details may be clarified. Each revision may feel like refinement rather than alteration. Memory accretion, the gradual accumulation of detail, is common in many kinds of extraordinary stories, not only time slips, but also ghost sightings, unusual encounters, and even ordinary personal anecdotes. The more a story is told, the more polished it becomes. There is also the quiet influence of expectation. If a place gains a reputation for strange experiences, visitors may arrive primed for anomaly. Priming does not create hallucinations, but it can influence interpretation. Think of entering a supposedly haunted house. Every creak feels charged with possibility. The same creak in your own home might go unnoticed. In cities known for time-slip lore, the mental framework is already prepared. When something ambiguous occurs, a flicker of light, a moment of dizziness, a brief misrecognition, the interpretation may lean toward the extraordinary. Yet it is important to say this softly. None of this implies deliberate invention. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We search for coherence. We seek narratives that help us understand what we felt. And time, perhaps more than any other dimension of experience, is woven into our sense of identity. Your memories define who you are. Your anticipation of tomorrow shapes your choices. the present moment feels like a thin edge between them. When that edge feels unstable, even briefly, it can be profoundly unsettling. So, we sit here, not dismissing, not declaring, but noticing the delicate architecture of perception and memory. Time slips may not require torn fabrics of the universe. They may arise from subtler threads, the way light falls at dusk, the way the brain predicts, the way memory paints. But before we settle too comfortably into psychological explanations, we must acknowledge something equally true. Physics itself has unsettled our confidence in time. And that story, the measured bending of clocks, the stretching of duration under motion and gravity, is not speculation. It is experiment. We will move there gently. Because understanding how time behaves in the laboratory may help us understand why it feels so solid in daily life, and why, on rare occasions, that solidity seems to flicker. Of all the time-slip stories, one of the most frequently discussed involves a quiet afternoon in the gardens of a French palace at the beginning of the 20th century. Two educated visitors wandered away from the main tour, searching for a smaller estate tucked within the grounds. What followed, according to their later account, was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There was no flash of light, no sound like thunder. Instead, there was a stillness. They described the air as heavy, the light as strangely muted, the atmosphere as tense and flattened, almost as if a depth had been reduced from the world. They encountered figures dressed in clothing from another century. They later came to believe they had glimpsed a moment from the late 1700s, possibly near the final years of the French monarchy. The story became famous. It was written into a book. It was debated in newspapers and societies interested in unusual phenomena. It has endured for over 100 years. But when we examine it carefully, not with hostility but with curiosity, something interesting emerges. The experience was not reported immediately. There was a gap of several months before it was formally documented. During that time, the two women discussed what had happened. They compared impressions. They reflected. When their notes were eventually compared in detail, they did not align perfectly. One remembered certain figures clearly, the other did not. One described a woman sketching in a white hat, the other did not mention her. Small differences appeared. This is not suspicious in itself. If two people witness the same ordinary event, their descriptions will often differ. Memory is selective, attention is limited. But over time, additional details were added to the narrative. The precise year of the supposed historical moment shifted slightly in different tellings. Contextual research was incorporated into later editions of the book. Architectural maps were consulted. Historical timelines were refined. The story became more coherent with each revision. This phenomenon is not unique to time slips. It happens in many extraordinary accounts. When people attempt to make sense of something unusual, they naturally seek external confirmation. They read about the location, they study its history, they compare maps, they look for photographs. Each new piece of information can subtly reshape memory. Imagine you have a vivid dream about a specific house. Later, you discover that a house like it once stood near your childhood home. That new knowledge can blend into your memory of the dream, making it feel prophetic rather than coincidental. In the case of the Versailles visitors, they returned to the gardens years later to retrace their steps. They searched for a bridge they believed they had crossed. They found old maps showing that such a bridge had once existed in earlier centuries. To some, this confirmed their experience. To others, it illustrated how easily historical research can interact with memory reconstruction. There is another element worth considering. Both women had previous interests in unusual or mystical experiences. This does not invalidate their account, but it suggests that their interpretive framework was already open to extraordinary possibilities. Interpretation shapes perception. If you walk through a historic estate expecting only architecture and gardens, a moment of dizziness may feel trivial. If you walk through the same estate with a deep appreciation for history and a fascination with the past, that same dizziness may feel significant. It is also notable that heat can affect perception. On very warm days, the body can become slightly dehydrated, blood pressure can fluctuate, mild disorientation can occur. The world can shimmer faintly in strong sunlight. Colours can appear washed out. Again, this does not dismiss the experience, it simply adds texture. When people revisit an unusual event over months and years, the memory often stabilizes into a narrative that feels internally consistent. That consistency can increase confidence. The story becomes polished, like a stone turned smooth, by repeated handling. We must approach this gently. There is a temptation to divide such stories into two categories: true or false, real or fabricated. But reality is often more nuanced. A person can sincerely experience something that feels extraordinary. That experience can later be reshaped by memory, discussion, and research. The final story may contain layers, some originating in perception, some in interpretation, some in hindsight. This layering is not a flaw in human cognition, it is a feature. Consider how historians reconstruct ancient events. They rely on partial records, they interpret, they infer. Over time, new evidence modifies the narrative. Memory operates in a similar way, but internally. There is also the social dimension. Once a story becomes public, others respond to it. Skeptics offer alternative explanations. Supporters defend it. Each exchange adds new perspectives. The Versailles case, for example, attracted explanations ranging from accidental participation in a historical costume event to shared misperception under environmental stress. Others suggested collective hallucination. Still others proposed genuine glimpses into the past. The debate itself became part of the story. And perhaps this is the most important lesson of the Versailles problem. It shows how an unusual experience can evolve over time, not necessarily through deception, but through reinterpretation. When we hear a time slip account decades after it occurred, we're not hearing the raw event. We're hearing the refined version, the remembered version, the version shaped by years of thought and conversation. This does not make it worthless, it makes it human. And it reminds us that before we turn to wormholes or parallel universes, we must account for the subtle, powerful ways memory behaves. Yet even after acknowledging this, something remains. The emotional intensity, the conviction, the vividness. These are not easily dismissed. They tell us that whatever happened, whether internal, external, or somewhere in between, it left a deep imprint. And deep imprints deserve careful study, not ridicule. So the Versailles story becomes not proof of time travel, nor proof of delusion, but a case study in how perception, memory, and historical context can intertwine. It's a reminder that time slips, whether literal or psychological, are not just about physics, they're about experience, and experience is shaped by the delicate architecture of the human mind. We will carry that awareness forward as we turn our attention towards something that does not depend on memory at all, because beyond human recollection lies a quieter question. How does time behave when measured not by stories, but by clocks? Some stories cling to places the way ivy clings to old stone. Over time, a location can gather a reputation. A whisper becomes a rumour becomes a pattern, and before long the pattern begins to feel like evidence. There are cities in the world known for ghost sightings, towns famous for strange lights in the sky, lakes said to hold mysterious creatures, and then there are places associated with time slips, where the past supposedly presses close to the present. Liverpool is often mentioned in this way. Certain streets, especially those rich with layered history, have become focal points for accounts of brief temporal shifts. A man walks into a shop that later seems not to exist. A young woman enters a storefront that closed years earlier. Underground tunnels echo with voices from another century. What makes such clustering interesting is not whether the stories are true, but why they cluster at all. Human beings are social creatures. We share stories. We listen to one another. When a location gains a reputation for the unusual, it subtly shapes expectations. Visitors arrive primed for anomaly. Residents view small oddities through a different lens. Imagine moving into a house, widely rumoured to be haunted. The first time you hear the heating system click in the walls, you may feel a jolt of significance. In another house, the same sound might barely register. Expectation does not create perception from nothing, but it can influence interpretation. There is a concept in psychology known as priming. When your mind is prepared to expect something, you're more likely to notice details that fit that expectation. If you're told that a forest contains rare blue flowers, you will begin scanning for hints of blue. If a city is said to have thin places in time, moments of dizziness or visual distortion may acquire meaning. Another layer to consider is the sheer depth of history beneath certain urban spaces. In older European cities, centuries are stacked quite literally beneath modern streets. Foundations rest upon earlier foundations. Roads overlay ancient pathways. Markets have risen and fallen in the same footprint. When you stand in such a place, you are already surrounded by invisible layers of time. Your mind knows this, even if you do not consciously think about it. Picture a cobblestone street after rain. The stones gleam, reflections shimmer, streetlights blur in puddles. In that softened light, the present can feel porous. Modern signs may fade into shadow. Architectural lines may echo older styles. The environment itself becomes suggestive. Now add the human love of narrative. Once several stories have been told about a particular street, each new account gains context. It is not isolated. It joins a growing tapestry. Online forums form. People compare experiences. Details align and reinforce one another. This does not require deceit. It requires community. Folklore scholars have long observed how certain motifs cluster geographically. A specific hill may be associated with fairy lights. A bridge may acquire tales of phantom travellers. The clustering becomes self-sustaining. Time slips, when they cluster, may follow a similar pattern. There is also something emotionally attractive about the idea that your city is special, that beneath your daily commute lies a hidden layer of mystery. It gives texture to ordinary life. This does not invalidate individual experiences. It simply reminds us that human culture and psychology are powerful forces. Consider how easily coincidence can strengthen belief. Suppose one person describes stepping into a shop that once existed decades ago. Later, someone else reports a similar experience on the same street. The similarity feels meaningful. Yet in a busy city with thousands of daily interactions and countless small perceptual anomalies, some coincidences are statistically inevitable. The human brain, however, is not a statistician. It is a storyteller. We connect dots, we weave threads, and over time the story becomes part of the identity of the place. Interestingly, when researchers examine many of these clustered time-slip accounts, they often find that documentation is thin. Stories circulate on websites, retold and reshaped. Details grow slightly more vivid with each version. A vanished hotel becomes more antique. A cafe becomes more perfectly vintage. Dialogue sharpens. Prices become oddly precise. The story becomes cinematic. This refinement is natural. Humans polish stories unconsciously. There is a phrase sometimes used in skeptical circles, too perfect. when a narrative unfolds with dramatic symmetry, when the protagonist conveniently meets someone who confirms the historical detail, it can raise eyebrows. But even this must be approached softly. Real life occasionally produces remarkable coincidences. Dismissing something solely because it feels cinematic would be simplistic. Instead, what matters is evidence. In most time-slip clusters, physical evidence is absent. No verified recordings, no corroborating independent documentation, no measurable environmental anomalies at the moment of the event. What remains are human reports. That may sound disappointing, but it is also revealing. Time slips, as cultural phenomena, may tell us less about physics and more about how humans relate to time. Cities are not merely collections of buildings, they're archives of memory. Walking through an old street can evoke a subtle sense of temporal layering even without any unusual event. The mind naturally imagines past lives unfolding in the same space, and imagination, when combined with sensory ambiguity, can produce powerful experiences. There is another dimension to consider: the way attention narrows during moments of stress. Several Liverpool accounts involve emotional intensity, being chased, being startled, feeling sudden panic. Under stress, perception can sharpen in some areas and distort in others. The brain prioritizes survival-relevant information. Peripheral details may blur. When perception is altered in this way, the environment can feel unreal. Pair that with a historically saturated setting, and the mind may reach backward for explanation. Again, this does not prove that all such experiences are internal constructs, but it provides a framework that does not require tears in the fabric of space and time. Still, even after acknowledging folklore clustering and psychological priming, a quiet curiosity remains. Why does the idea of slipping into another era feel so intuitively plausible? Perhaps because physics itself has already shown us that time is not as fixed as it appears. And unlike folklore, those discoveries were not whispered in tunnels or posted on message boards. They were measured with clocks, very precise clocks. Up to this point, we have stayed close to human experience, memory, perception, culture, expectation. But now we step into a different kind of evidence, not stories, clocks. There was a time, not very long ago in the grand sweep of history, when scientists believed time flowed the same everywhere. A second in London was the same as a second in New York. A minute on a mountaintop was identical to a minute at sea level. Time was thought to be universal, absolute, a steady river moving at the same pace for everyone. Then came a quiet revolution. Albert Einstein proposed something deeply unsettling. Time is not fixed. It stretches and compresses depending on motion and gravity. This idea, called relativity, does not mean that time becomes chaotic or unpredictable. It means that time is woven together with space into something more flexible than we once imagined. Imagine two identical clocks. One rests quietly on a table, the other is placed aboard a high-speed aircraft. When the aircraft lands and the clocks are compared, they will no longer agree perfectly. The moving clock will have ticked ever so slightly more slowly. The difference is tiny, far too small for you to notice in daily life, but it is measurable with extremely precise instruments. Similarly, place one clock at sea level and another at the top of a tall mountain. The clock higher up, where gravity pulls just a little less strongly, will tick slightly faster. Again, the difference is minute, but it is real. To understand why, it helps to think in images rather than equations. Picture space and time not as separate things, but as a flexible fabric. Massive objects like planets and stars press into that fabric, creating gentle curves. The stronger the gravity, the deeper the curve. Time flows more slowly deeper in that curve. This is not poetic metaphor alone. It has been confirmed experimentally using atomic clocks, devices so precise that they measure time based on the steady rhythm of atoms vibrating at consistent frequencies. These clocks are sensitive enough to detect differences in time between 2 points separated by only a small change in height. Even satellites orbiting Earth must account for this effect. The system that allows your phone to pinpoint your location, the global positioning system, depend on extremely accurate timing signals from satellites high above the planet. Because those satellites are both moving quickly and experiencing weaker gravity than we do on the ground, their onboard clocks tick at slightly different rates. If engineers did not correct for this difference, your navigation system would drift by miles within a day. So here we have something important. Time does not behave identically everywhere. It is not an unchanging background. It bends. But before imagination runs too far, we must pause. The bending of time described by relativity is gentle, predictable, measurable. The differences are tiny under everyday conditions. You cannot step onto a mountaintop and suddenly leap into the future by decades. The effect exists, but it is subtle, and that subtlety matters. Time slips, as described in anecdotal accounts, involve dramatic shifts, entire environments transforming from one era to another. Relativity does not predict such events on street corners or in gardens. Still, the fact that time can stretch at all changes the philosophical landscape. It tells us that time is not rigid. It tells us that the ticking of a clock is not universal. And perhaps most intriguingly, it suggests that time and space are intertwined in ways that defy simple intuition. There is another implication that deserves gentle attention. In relativity, there is no single universal now that everyone shares. Two observers moving differently can disagree about the order of events. What feels simultaneous to one may not be simultaneous to another. This does not create paradoxes in everyday life, because the differences are extremely small at normal speeds. But at cosmic scales, the concept of a shared present becomes less clear. If time is flexible and relative, then the idea of it as a single flowing river becomes more of a useful approximation than an absolute truth. For centuries, we imagine time as a straight line passed behind us, future ahead, present as a thin knife edge between them. Relativity softens that image. Instead of a rigid line, time becomes part of a four-dimensional landscape. 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time woven together. You move through this landscape not just spatially, but temporally. You're always moving forward in time at a steady pace, much like you're always moving forward in life, even when standing still. Yet that forward movement is influenced by motion and gravity. This does not validate time slips, but it does invite humility. If physics itself reveals that time is not as simple as it appears, then we must acknowledge that our everyday intuition is limited. There is something comforting about clocks. They tick evenly. They divide our days into neat segments. They give structure to life. But beneath that structure lies a deeper truth. Time is dynamic. Now, you might wonder, if time can stretch and compress, could it fold? Could there be shortcuts? Could 2 distant moments connect the way 2 points on a folded sheet of paper might touch? The mathematics of relativity allows for such possibilities in theory. Concepts known as wormholes describe hypothetical tunnels connecting distant regions of space, and perhaps even different times. But here again, theory does not equal everyday reality. Wormholes, if they exist at all, would require conditions far beyond anything we encounter on city streets. They would demand exotic forms of energy and stability we have not observed in nature. So we hold 2 truths at once. Time bends, but gently. The universe permits strange geometries, but we have no evidence of them opening on sidewalks. And yet, The simple act of discovering that clocks disagree with one another has already reshaped our understanding of existence. The next step in this journey will take us deeper still, into a realm where particles behave like waves, where cause and effect blur at microscopic scales. Because if relativity unsettled our sense of time's rigidity, quantum physics unsettled something even more fundamental, our sense of certainty. For now, let the idea settle softly. Time is not absolute. It stretches under motion, it flows differently in gravity. And while these effects are small, they remind us that the universe is more flexible than it appears at first glance. Before we travel further into the deep mathematics of time, it is worth pausing at another kind of explanation, one that feels closer to the ground beneath our feet. Not relativity, not quantum mechanics, but fields, currents, invisible forces that move quietly through the Earth. Some researchers and enthusiasts have suggested that time-slip experiences may be connected to electromagnetic activity. The Earth itself is wrapped in a magnetic field, generated deep within its core. This field is not static. It fluctuates gently with solar activity, with tides, with the shifting layers of our planet. You cannot see it, but you live inside it. When charged particles from the Sun interact with Earth's magnetic shield, they can create subtle disturbances. In polar regions, these interactions become visible as shimmering auroras. In other places, they are mostly invisible, slight variations in magnetic intensity that sensitive instruments can detect. Now imagine adding to that the electrical infrastructure of a modern city. Rail systems carrying high voltage current, power lines humming softly above streets, underground cables looping beneath sidewalks. These systems create localized electromagnetic environments. Nothing extraordinary, just the quiet hum of modern civilization. There is a hypothesis, and it is important to emphasize that it remains a hypothesis, suggesting that under certain rare conditions, natural geomagnetic fluctuations might interact with man-made electrical systems in ways that subtly influence human perception. This idea does not claim that magnetic fields open portals. It suggests something gentler. The human brain operates through electrical activity. Neurons communicate by tiny pulses of voltage. These signals are extraordinarily small, but they are the foundation of thought, sensation, memory. Because the brain is electrical, it is reasonable to ask whether strong external electromagnetic fields could influence perception. There have been experiments exploring whether changes in magnetic fields can alter mood, attention, or even produce unusual sensations in some individuals. Results have been mixed and often modest. No clear, dramatic effects have been reliably demonstrated in everyday environments. Still, the question remains open at the edges. In certain coastal cities, where tidal forces interact with conductive seawater and urban infrastructure, magnetic variations may be slightly more complex. Some have speculated that such environments could contribute to anomalous experiences. Again, this is speculative, but it is grounded in a real foundation. The Earth's magnetic field exists, it fluctuates. Electrical systems generate localized fields. From there, the leap is made. Could rare combinations of these influences create brief perceptual distortions? Not time travel, but altered interpretation of sensory input. Consider how sensitive the brain already is. A small drop in blood sugar can cause dizziness. Mild dehydration can blur perception. Lack of sleep can produce brief visual distortions. The boundary between stable perception and altered perception is thinner than we like to imagine. If environmental electromagnetic variations were ever strong enough to nudge neural activity slightly off its usual rhythm, the resulting experience might feel strange, dreamlike, detached. That sensation could then be interpreted through the lens of history, culture, and expectation. It is also worth noting what this hypothesis does not claim. There is no solid evidence that geomagnetic fluctuations cause people to see centuries shift around them. There are no controlled experiments showing magnetic fields producing detailed historical visions. There are no repeatable laboratory demonstrations of time slipping in high-voltage environments. The idea remains in the realm of possibility, not proof. It belongs in the category of proposed mechanisms, not established physics. And that distinction matters. Sometimes, when a mysterious experience occurs, the temptation is to leap directly to exotic explanations. Wormholes, colliding universes, tears in space-time. The electromagnetic hypothesis is more modest. It suggests that perception may be influenced by subtle environmental conditions, that the world outside and the world inside the skull are not entirely separate. It also reminds us that we are biological organisms embedded within a dynamic planet. You're not floating in empty space. You're standing on a rotating sphere wrapped in magnetic lines, bathed in solar radiation threaded with electric currents. Most of the time, these forces are steady enough to fade into the background of awareness, but occasionally the background may shift slightly. And if that shift coincides with a moment of emotional vulnerability or environmental ambiguity, the experience could feel profound. There is something strangely poetic about this possibility. Not that the past breaks through into the present, but that the invisible hum of the earth and our own neural rhythms briefly fall out of sync. Still, we must remain grounded. The measured bending of time in relativity is supported by experiment. The influence of strong electromagnetic fields on perception is still uncertain and subtle, and there is no credible evidence that city rail systems are generating temporal vortices. It is easy to draw sweeping conclusions from incomplete data, harder to sit with uncertainty. So we let this idea rest where it belongs, as one attempt among many to understand why some experiences feel so otherworldly. Perhaps the environment plays a small role, perhaps it does not. What we know for certain is that humans are exquisitely sensitive to changes in light, in sound, in internal chemistry, in external fields, and sometimes sensitivity can feel like revelation. As we move forward, we will encounter another proposal, one less tied to physical forces and more to the patterns of the human mind itself. Because even without magnetic currents or solar fluctuations, there is something powerful within us that seeks structure in randomness, and that search for structure can be just as compelling as any invisible field. Until now, most of what we have explored has lived in the realm of experience. How places feel, how memory reshapes events, how expectation can guide perception. But now we step into something quieter and more solid. Measurement. Not stories told decades later, not sensations in old streets, but clocks placed side by side and compared. For centuries, time was assumed to flow, identically everywhere. A second here was the same as a second anywhere else. The universe was imagined as having a great invisible metronome, ticking evenly for all. Then came a gentle upheaval. Albert Einstein proposed that time does not move the same way for everyone. Instead, it stretches and compresses depending on motion and gravity. This idea, called relativity, does not make time chaotic. It makes it flexible. Let us approach this softly. Imagine two identical clocks, built with extraordinary precision. One remains on Earth, the other is placed on a fast-moving aircraft and flown around the planet. When the travelling clock returns and the two are compared, they no longer match perfectly. The moving clock has ticked just a tiny bit more slowly. Not by minutes, not by seconds you could notice, but by a measurable fraction of a second. The difference is small, astonishingly small, yet detectable with instruments sensitive enough to measure the steady vibration of atoms. Now, imagine something even gentler. Place one clock at sea level and another high on a mountain. The clock on the mountain will tick slightly faster than the one below. Why? Because gravity influences time. The stronger the gravitational pull, the more time slows. The weaker the pull, the more time speeds up. Though speeds up here means only by an almost unimaginably small amount. Picture space and time woven together like a soft fabric. A massive object, like Earth, presses into that fabric, creating a shallow curve. The deeper you are in that curve, the more slowly time flows, relative to someone standing higher up. This is not metaphor alone. Atomic clocks, devices that measure time by tracking the natural rhythm of atoms, are so precise that even lifting one a short distance above the ground produces a detectable difference. These differences are not dramatic. They do not cause people on mountaintops to leap years ahead of those at sea level. The variations are tiny, measured in billionths of a second, but they are real. There's another place where this effect matters every single day. The satellites that help your phone determine its location orbit high above Earth. They move quickly. They also experience slightly weaker gravity than we do on the surface. Because of their speed and position, their onboard clocks tick at rates subtly different from clocks on the ground. Engineers must correct for this difference. Without those corrections, navigation systems would drift, accumulating errors that could grow into miles within a short time. So here is something remarkable. Time is not absolute. Two clocks, built identically, can disagree depending on how they move and where they are placed. This fact has been tested repeatedly. It is not folklore, it is not anecdote, it is experiment. And yet, even as we let this settle in, we must hold on to another truth. The effects are small. Relativity does not predict that someone walking through a garden will suddenly step decades into the past. It does not suggest that city streets can spontaneously open into earlier centuries. The bending of time under everyday conditions is subtle, far too subtle to account for dramatic time-slip narratives. But relativity does something else. It changes how we think about now. In classical thinking, the present moment is universal. If something is happening here right now, it is happening now everywhere. Relativity softens that certainty. Two observers moving differently may disagree about whether two distant events occurred at the same time. What feels simultaneous to one may not feel simultaneous to another. Again, these differences are usually too small to notice in daily life, but conceptually they matter. They tell us that the universe does not provide a single, shared present moment for all observers. Instead, time and space are intertwined into a four-dimensional structure. 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time woven together. You move through this structure constantly, not only through space, but also forward through time. You're always travelling through time at a steady pace, 1 second per second, you might say, though we will avoid turning that into a formula. It is simply the steady progression of experience. Relativity suggests that this steady progression can be influenced, ever so slightly, by motion and gravity. The twin thought experiment illustrates this gently. Imagine 2 identical twins. One remains on Earth, the other travels in a spacecraft at extremely high speed and then returns. The travelling twin will have aged slightly less than the one who stayed behind, not by years under ordinary circumstances, but by a measurable amount if the journey were long and fast enough. This is not fantasy. It is a prediction confirmed indirectly by many experiments. Still, we must be careful not to let imagination outrun measurement. Relativity allows time to stretch. It does not allow spontaneous leaps across centuries without extreme conditions, such as those near massive cosmic objects like black holes. And even then, the effect is not a jump into the past. It is a slowing relative to someone far away. So where does this leave us? On one hand, the universe is stranger than everyday intuition suggests. Time is flexible, clocks can disagree. The present is not universally shared in the way we once imagined. On the other hand, these effects are precise and constrained. They follow mathematical rules. They require immense speed or gravity. The quiet bending of time does not resemble the sudden environmental transformations described in time-slip accounts. But it does accomplish something important. It loosens the rigid picture of time as a straight, unchanging river. It invites us to consider that time might be more like a landscape, shaped, curved, influenced. And once we accept that time is woven into the fabric of the cosmos rather than ticking independently, above it a new question emerges. If the fabric can bend gently under gravity, could it ever fold more dramatically? The mathematics suggests possibilities. Whether nature allows them is another matter. We will explore that carefully, without rushing, without exaggerating. For now, let the image settle softly. Two clocks, side by side, built the same, disagreeing, just a little. Enough to remind us that time is not as simple as it appears. When you first hear that time can stretch, it feels manageable, subtle, measured in tiny fractions that only atomic clocks can detect. But once you accept that space and time are woven together, another image begins to form. If fabric can curve, could it also fold? Let us approach this carefully, the way one might approach a deep pool of water, slowly, allowing the surface to settle before looking down. In the mathematics of relativity, there exist solutions that describe tunnels through space-time. These tunnels are tunnels often called Einstein-Rosen bridges. The name sounds dramatic, but the idea can be pictured simply. Imagine you have a sheet of paper representing space and time. 2 points lie far apart on its surface. If you travel across the paper in a straight line, the journey is long. Now gently fold the paper so that those 2 distant points touch. If you could move through the fold itself, the journey would be almost instantaneous. This is the shortcut analogy often used to describe a wormhole. Instead of travelling across the long surface of space-time, you would pass through a kind of bridge connecting 2 regions. Mathematically, such bridges are allowed within the equations of general relativity. The equations themselves do not forbid them. In that sense, wormholes are not pure fantasy. They are possibilities written into the language of gravity. But possibility in mathematics does not automatically become reality in nature. There is a crucial condition for a wormhole to remain open, for it not to collapse immediately. It would require a form of matter or energy with unusual properties, something that behaves differently from anything we have observed in everyday physics. This hypothetical substance is often described as having negative energy density. That phrase can sound technical, so let us translate it gently. Ordinary matter has positive energy. It adds weight to the universe. It deepens the curve of space-time. The proposed exotic matter would do something stranger. It would push outward against gravity in a way ordinary matter does not. It would help hold open the tunnel rather than allowing it to pinch shut. So far, no confirmed observations have demonstrated the existence of such stable exotic matter in the quantities required to sustain a wormhole. There are small quantum effects, fleeting and subtle, that hint at unusual energy behavior on microscopic scales. But scaling those tiny fluctuations up to something large enough for a person to walk through remains entirely speculative. And even if wormholes did exist, there are additional complications. Some theoretical models suggest that attempting to use a wormhole for time travel would destabilize it. Others imply that nature may enforce consistency conditions preventing paradoxes. The mathematics grows intricate quickly, and we will not wander too far into that forest tonight. Instead, we pause with what we know. The equations of gravity allow curved space-time. They allow, under certain extreme conditions, geometries that resemble tunnels. But no experiment has observed such a structure in the wild. No telescope has captured a stable, traversable bridge between eras. Wormholes belong in the category of mathematically permitted, physically unconfirmed. That distinction is important. When people speak of time slips as if a street corner briefly opened into another century, the image resembles a spontaneous wormhole, a local folding of time allowing two distant moments to touch. But the physics required for even a theoretical wormhole is immense. It involves gravitational forces comparable to those near black holes, or energy conditions we do not know how to produce. City sidewalks do not host such extremes. Still, the concept serves a philosophical purpose. It shows that our universe is not limited to flat geometry. The cosmos can curve, it can twist, it can form shapes far stranger than our senses reveal. And this matters because it widens imagination without abandoning science. There is a delicate balance here. On one side lies rigid dismissal, the insistence that time is simple and closed. On the other side lies unrestrained fantasy, the belief that hidden tunnels open casually in familiar places. Between those extremes lies curiosity guided by evidence. Wormholes remind us that the universe's architecture is more flexible than classical intuition suggested, but flexibility is not the same as accessibility. Even if such bridges exist, somewhere in the vastness of the cosmos, they would not be casual doorways waiting in urban streets. And yet, the image persists. Two distant moments touching, the past brushing the present like pages of a book pressed together. There is something deeply human in that image. We long for connection across time. We revisit memories. We preserve photographs. We build monuments. We write diaries so that our present can speak to the future. In a way, culture itself is a kind of wormhole, not through physics but through narrative. A letter written a century ago can transport you emotionally into another era. A preserved building can evoke lives long gone. Perhaps what we sometimes interpret as literal folding is instead the extraordinary power of context and imagination. But before we reduce everything to psychology, we must step into an even stranger domain. Relativity reshaped our understanding of gravity and motion. Quantum physics reshapes something more intimate, the nature of reality at its smallest scales. Because when scientists began examining particles, they discovered behavior that defied common sense. Particles that behave like waves, outcomes that depend on measurement, connections that stretch across distance without visible threads. And in that microscopic world, time itself begins to feel less straightforward. If relativity bent the fabric gently, quantum theory frays its edges. So we move forward with care, not toward tunnels in gardens, but toward the quiet laboratory experiments that reveal just how subtle and surprising the foundations of reality truly are. When we speak casually, we describe time as though it flows. We say time passes. We say moments slip away. We say the future approaches and the past recedes behind us. This language feels natural, almost unquestionable. But relativity invites a quieter, more unsettling possibility. What if time does not flow at all? What if it simply is? Imagine standing on a vast plain at dawn. The landscape stretches in all directions. Hills rise in the distance, valleys dip out of sight. The train does not move toward you. It exists already laid out. Now imagine that instead of walking through space alone, you are moving along a path that includes time as one of its dimensions. You're not watching time flow past you like a river. You're travelling through a four-dimensional landscape, 3 dimensions of space, and one of time woven together. This idea is sometimes called the block universe. In this view, past, present, and future are not being created moment by moment. They coexist as parts of a larger structure. Your life is like a line drawn through that structure, tracing a path from birth to death. The events do not vanish once they are behind you. They remain as coordinates in the landscape of space-time. This does not mean you can wander freely backward. It means that from the perspective of the universe's geometry, every event occupies its place. Relativity supports this interpretation in a subtle way. Because different observers can disagree about what is happening now, there is no single universal slice of present shared by all. If no universal present exists, then perhaps the division between past and future is not fundamental to reality itself, but to our experience of it. Let us soften that. Your brain experiences time sequentially. Neurons fire in patterns that move forward. Memory accumulates behind you. Anticipation stretches ahead. This gives you the sensation of flowing time. But the underlying physical description of the universe does not require a moving spotlight illuminating one moment at a time. Instead, the entire structure may simply exist. Picture a loaf of bread sliced into thin pieces. Each slice represents a moment in time. From the outside, all slices exist at once. From within one slice, you only experience that thin cross-section. You cannot see the other slices directly, but they are part of the same loaf. In the block universe view, your present moment is one slice among many. This idea can feel unsettling at first. It seems to challenge free will. If the future already exists as part of the landscape, are your choices predetermined? Philosophers debate this carefully. Some argue that even if the structure of your life exists as a whole, your choices are part of that structure. You still act, decide, influence. The path is not imposed from outside. It is defined by your own actions within the fabric. Others suggest that the sensation of choice remains meaningful, even if the universe is a fixed geometry. We need not settle that debate tonight. What matters for our exploration of time slips is something else. If time is a landscape rather than a flowing river, then the separation between past and present is not absolute in the underlying geometry. It is absolute in your perception. This does not imply that streets can open into earlier eras, but it reframes the metaphysical question. Instead of asking whether the past can return, we might ask whether our perception of only now exists is incomplete. There is also something comforting in this image. If the past remains part of the structure of reality, then nothing truly disappears. Moments do not evaporate. They occupy their coordinates forever within the cosmic geometry. A childhood afternoon remains etched into the structure of space-time. A conversation long forgotten still exists in its slice of the loaf. From within your present awareness, those moments feel gone. From the outside perspective of the block universe, they are simply elsewhere in the landscape. This is not mystical thinking. It arises from taking relativity seriously and following its implications. Still, we must be careful. The block universe is an interpretation of relativity, not an experimentally separate discovery. It is a way of describing what the mathematics implies about simultaneity and structure. It does not provide mechanisms for crossing between slices. It does not predict spontaneous overlaps of centuries. The geometry may contain all moments, but your path through it is fixed by the speed of light and the structure of causality. And yet, something about this interpretation resonates with time-slip narratives. Witnesses often describe feeling as though they brushed against another layer of reality. Not that they were transported in a machine, but that two moments briefly touched. In the block universe image, layers of time are indeed part of a larger whole, but touching between layers would require breaking the rules that govern motion through that structure, and those rules are strict. light defines the ultimate speed limit in our universe, because precedes effect in a way preserved by relativity. So while the philosophical landscape allows coexistence of all times, it does not allow casual wandering across them. Still, the idea leaves us with a profound shift. Time may not be something that flows, it may be something we move through. And if that is true, then the sensation of passing time, the ticking clock, the fading memory, the anticipation of tomorrow, arises not from time itself moving, but from consciousness tracing its path through a fixed geometry. That realization alone can feel like a kind of time slip, not into the past, but into a deeper understanding of what now really means. Yet even this may not be the final word, because when physicists look beneath relativity into the quantum realm, they find something even stranger. At the smallest scales, the structure of time becomes less clear. The equations describing particles sometimes work equally well, whether time runs forward or backward. The arrow that seems so obvious in daily life becomes harder to locate in fundamental laws. And there, at the quantum edge, certainty begins to loosen once more. So we will step gently into that domain next, not to chase paradox, but to see how deeply the mystery of time truly runs. So far, we have bent time gently. We have curved it under gravity. We've imagined it as a landscape rather than a river. We've allowed past and future to coexist within a larger structure. Now we move inward, not outward into cosmic geometry, but inward into the microscopic realm. And here, something unexpected happens. The rules begin to soften. In everyday life, objects behave in ways that feel intuitive. A ball rolls across the floor. A cup sits solidly on a table. A stone falls when dropped. But when scientists began examining the smallest building blocks of matter, electrons, photons, and other tiny constituents of reality, they discovered behavior that defied common sense. Imagine shining light through two narrow openings in a barrier and observing what happens on a screen behind it. If light were purely a collection of tiny particles, like grains of sand, you would expect two bright stripes to appear on the screen, one behind each opening. But when this experiment is performed carefully, a pattern of alternating bright and dark bands emerges instead. This pattern resembles what you would see if light were behaving like a wave, spreading out, overlapping with itself, creating regions of reinforcement and cancellation. Even stranger, when particles such as electrons are sent through the openings one at a time, the same wave-like pattern gradually forms. It is as though each particle travels not as a tiny marble choosing one path, but as a cloud of possibility exploring multiple paths at once. This behavior is called wave-particle duality, though the name can sound heavier than the idea needs to be. In softer language, we might say this: at microscopic scales, entities do not behave like solid beads. They behave like probabilities until something fixes their outcome. When a measurement is made, when the particle interacts with a detector, the cloud of possibilities narrows into a specific result. Before that interaction, it is not accurate to imagine the particle as simply being in one definite place. This does not mean particles are conscious. It does not mean human observation creates reality through intention. It means that interaction matters. Reality at the smallest scales is not built from solid certainty. It is built from structured possibility. Now pause for a moment and let that settle. If the foundations of matter are not tiny billiard balls moving along clear trajectories, but rather waves of potential that become definite through interaction, then the world is less rigid than it appears. There is another phenomenon known as entanglement. Imagine two dice rolled in separate rooms. Normally, the outcome of one has no connection to the other, but in certain quantum experiments, two particles can become linked in such a way that measuring one instantly determines the state of the other, even if they are separated by large distances. This does not allow information to travel faster than light. It does not permit secret communication, but it reveals that the universe maintains correlations deeper than classical intuition would suggest. In everyday terms, we might describe entangled particles as linked coins that always show opposite faces, no matter how far apart they are carried. Again, this does not prove time travel. It does not suggest portals, but it reveals something profound. The microscopic world is not governed by simple, deterministic certainty. Now consider time within this quantum framework. In many of the fundamental equations describing particles, time appears symmetrically. If you replace forward with backward in the mathematics, the equations still function. This is subtle, but important. At the level of fundamental interactions, the laws do not strongly prefer a direction. Yet in daily life, time feels directional. Eggs break. They do not unbreak. Smoke disperses. It does not gather itself neatly back into the chimney. This arrow of time, this sense that the past differs from the future, arises from thermodynamics, from the tendency of systems to move from ordered states toward disorder. But at the microscopic level, the laws themselves are less committed to forward flow. This opens philosophical questions. If the smallest building blocks of reality do not inherently prefer a direction of time, could our experience of time be emergent, arising from large-scale statistical behavior rather than from fundamental necessity? We must tread carefully here. Quantum mechanics does not predict people slipping into other centuries. It does not provide mechanisms for macroscopic time travel. The quantum effects observed in laboratories are fragile. They occur at scales far smaller than human experience. Once systems become large and interact with their environment, classical behavior reasserts itself. The weirdness smooths out. Still, the fact remains that the foundation of reality is not built from solid certainty. It is built from probabilistic patterns that solidify only through interaction. This matters because it humbles our assumptions. If matter itself is less definite than it appears, perhaps our everyday picture of time as a rigid arrow is also incomplete. But incomplete does not mean chaotic. Quantum theory is one of the most precisely tested frameworks in science. Its predictions match experiments to extraordinary accuracy. The mystery lies not in its failure, but in its strangeness. And so, as we explore time slips, we must keep this distinction clear. Quantum mechanics reveals that reality at small scales behaves in ways that challenge intuition. It does not validate spontaneous temporal overlaps in gardens or city streets. Yet it reminds us that the universe is subtler than surface appearances suggest, and in that subtlety lies both caution and wonder. Because if time emerges from deeper layers of structure, then understanding those layers may change how we think about past and future altogether. The next step takes us further into that territory, into the question of whether time itself might run both ways at its deepest level, not in experience, but in the equations that describe the dance of particles. In daily life, time feels like an arrow. It moves from yesterday toward tomorrow. It carries you forward whether you wish it to or not. You remember the past. You anticipate the future. You never confuse the two. Yet when physicists write down the fundamental laws that govern particles, something curious appears. Many of the core equations work just as well if time is reversed. If you were to take the mathematical description of certain interactions and replace forward in time with backward in time, the structure of the equation would remain valid. The relationships between quantities would still hold. That does not mean reality runs backward in ordinary experience. It means the underlying laws themselves do not strongly prefer a direction. Let us soften that, dear. Imagine watching a short video clip of two billiard balls colliding. If you played the clip forward, it would look normal. If you played it backward, it would also look physically plausible. The balls would approach, collide, and separate. Without additional context, you might not know which direction is correct. Now, imagine watching a video of a glass shattering on the floor. Played forward, it looks ordinary. Played backward, it looks absurd. Shards flying upward and assembling themselves into a perfect glass. The difference between these two examples lies not in the fundamental forces, but in probability. At microscopic scales, interactions between particles are largely reversible, but at large scales, systems tend toward disorder. This statistical tendency gives rise to what we call the arrow of time. Entropy, a word that describes the degree of disorder in a system, even as it generally increases. Ordered, states become less ordered over time, but the laws governing individual particles do not strongly enforce that direction. This raises a subtle philosophical question. If the deepest laws do not insist on forward flow, then perhaps the sense of time's arrow emerges from collective behaviour rather than from fundamental necessity. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics take this symmetry seriously and explore ideas sometimes grouped under the term retrocausality. The word can sound dramatic, so let us define it gently. Retrocausality suggests that under certain interpretations, effects might influence causes in subtle ways within the formalism of quantum theory, not in the sense of people sending messages to their own past, but in the way mathematical descriptions can treat past and future events symmetrically. This is an interpretation, not an experimental fact. There are physicists who explore models in which information flows in both temporal directions at the microscopic level, though always constrained in such a way that paradoxes do not appear in everyday life. No experiment has demonstrated a person influencing yesterday's weather or altering historical events. What these discussions reveal is something quieter. Our everyday assumption that time is fundamentally one-directional may be incomplete. The direction we experience could arise from boundary conditions, from the initial low-entropy state of the universe, rather than from the deepest equations themselves. Think of it like this. If you roll a ball down a hill, gravity pulls it downward, but gravity itself does not forbid the ball from being pushed uphill by some other force. The downward motion is common because it aligns with the overall configuration of the environment. Similarly, time appears to flow forward because the universe began in a highly ordered state. As disorder increases, the forward direction becomes statistically dominant. But the microscopic laws are more flexible. This flexibility has inspired imaginative proposals. Some have wondered whether rare fluctuations or unusual configurations might allow temporary anomalies in time's direction. Again, no empirical evidence supports macroscopic reversals. The equations may allow symmetric solutions, but reality as observed remains consistent. Still, there is something deeply humbling here. At the bedrock of physics, the distinction between past and future is less rigid than our intuition suggests. Now, consider time slips in this context. If someone experiences a moment that feels like a crossing between eras, one might be tempted to invoke these symmetric laws as support. But we must be careful not to overextend. The symmetry in equations does not imply that city streets become portals. It does not imply that centuries overlap. It suggests only that our conceptual framework for time may be incomplete, and that incompleteness leaves room for humility. There is also another interpretation of quantum mechanics that approaches the question differently. Instead of allowing subtle backward influence, it proposes that all possible outcomes occur, branching into separate, non-communicating realities. That idea belongs to another session, which we will explore soon. For now, we remain with symmetry. Imagine holding a perfectly balanced coin in your hand. It could fall heads or tails. The laws governing its motion do not prefer one face over the other. Similarly, at the smallest scales, time may not prefer one direction. But once the coin lands and many such events accumulate, patterns emerge, history forms, memory builds, the arrow becomes visible. The important distinction is scale. Microscopic reversibility does not equal macroscopic time travel. The laws may be symmetric, but the universe we inhabit exhibits strong directional structure. Eggs do not reassemble, ash does not leap back into logs. You do not wake up younger than when you went to sleep. The symmetry lies beneath their surface, not in daily life. Yet that hidden symmetry reminds us that the flow of time, so obvious to experience, is not written into the universe in the way we once assumed. It emerges, and when something emerges rather than being fundamental, it invites deeper inquiry. Time may be less like a rigid conveyor belt and more like a pattern arising from deeper statistical processes. Understanding that does not validate time slips, but it does expand the horizon of what time truly means. And as we widen that horizon, we encounter another provocative idea, one that does not bend time backward, but multiplies it sideways. The notion that every quantum possibility unfolds into its own branch of reality, not overlapping in our experience, but coexisting in ways we cannot directly perceive. That idea too must be handled carefully, because speculation without restraint can easily outrun evidence. So we will approach it gently. If time at the smallest scales does not insist on a single direction, another question naturally follows. What happens to possibility? In quantum physics, when a particle behaves like a cloud of potential outcomes, the mathematics does not specify in advance which one must occur. Instead, it assigns probabilities. When an interaction takes place, one outcome becomes real, at least from our perspective. But there is an interpretation of quantum theory that takes a more expansive view. It suggests that all possible outcomes occur, not sequentially, not blended together, but branching. This idea is often called the many worlds interpretation. Let us approach it with calm, because it is both fascinating and frequently misunderstood. Imagine flipping a coin. In everyday life, the coin lands either heads or tails. The other possibility vanishes. In the many worlds picture, both outcomes occur, but in separate, non-communicating branches of reality. In one branch, the coin lands heads. In another, tails. Each branch continues its own history, unaware of the other. This does not mean copies of you are constantly meeting one another. It does not mean branches collide like intersecting highways. It is a way of interpreting the mathematics of quantum theory without introducing a special rule that collapses possibilities into a single outcome. In this view, the universe continually differentiates into countless variations at the microscopic level. The scale of branching is enormous and constant. But once branches separate, they do not overlap again. They evolve independently. Now pause. Does this interpretation imply that time slips might occur when two branches brush against one another? It is tempting to imagine that. But there is no evidence that macroscopic branches reconnect or bleed into each other. The theory itself does not predict crossovers. It describes divergence, not collision. The branching happens at scales far smaller than human perception. By the time events become large enough to notice, a person walking down a street, a city evolving through decades, the branches are effectively isolated. The many worlds interpretation is elegant in a particular way. It preserves the mathematical structure of quantum theory without adding additional mechanisms. But it remains an interpretation. It does not produce new testable predictions distinct from other interpretations. As of now, there is no experiment that can decisively confirm that branching universes literally exist. And yet, it reshapes imagination. If every possible outcome unfolds somewhere in the vast structure of reality, then there may exist versions of familiar places in slightly different historical configurations in other branches, inaccessible to us. It is a poetic idea, a city where certain buildings were never demolished, a world where a decision was made differently, a life that took another turn. But poetry must not be mistaken for physics. The many worlds interpretation does not imply that you can step sideways into those alternate histories. It does not allow communication between branches. It does not suggest thin spots where realities overlap. It describes a multiplication of histories, not a blending of them. Still, it raises a deeper question. If the quantum level contains vast multiplicity, and the macroscopic world emerges from that level, how firm is the boundary between possibility and actuality? In daily life, the boundary feels absolute. What happened, happened. What did not happen, did not. Quantum theory reminds us that beneath that clarity lies a sea of potential, but potential does not equal accessibility. A thought experiment may help. Imagine a book containing every possible version of a story. Each page describes a slightly different unfolding. When you read one page, you're experiencing one version. The other pages exist in the book, but you do not read them simultaneously. You do not see their text bleeding through. The many worlds interpretation suggests that reality may be like such a book, containing all possible narratives. But your conscious experience follows one page at a time. Time slips, in contrast, would require pages to overlap, text from one narrative suddenly appearing in another. There is no evidence of such overlap. The mathematics does not predict it. And yet the image of branching worlds resonates with human curiosity. We often wonder about alternate choices. What if I had taken another path? What if history had turned differently? In that sense, the many worlds idea is less about literal portals and more about confronting the immensity of possibility embedded within the universe's fabric. It stretches imagination without violating known experimental results. But it also teaches restraint. Just because physics allows multiple consistent interpretations does not mean extraordinary claims gain support by association. Quantum branching, if it occurs, remains hidden beneath the scale of everyday experience. The world we inhabit appears coherent and continuous. Still, the progression from relativity to quantum theory has done something profound. We began with clocks that disagree. We moved to curved space-time and hypothetical tunnels. We explored symmetry and fundamental laws. Now we stand before multiplicity, the idea that reality itself may not be singular. And at this point, another speculative idea often enters the conversation. If reality is layered, probabilistic, and perhaps branching, could it be something even stranger? Could it be computed? Could the world we experience be rendered moment by moment by deeper informational processes? This is not physics in the experimental sense. It is philosophy at the edge of physics, and like the ideas before it, it must be handled with calm and clarity. So we turn next not toward alternate worlds colliding, but toward the possibility that the world itself is structured more like a simulation than a solid object. Not as a claim, but as a thought experiment worth examining gently. After bending time, branching worlds, and reversible equations, we arrive at an idea that feels at once modern and ancient. What if reality is not fundamentally made of solid matter at all? What if it is, in some sense, informational? The simulation hypothesis begins not with physics, but with philosophy. It asks a simple question. If intelligent civilizations continue to develop technology, might they one day create detailed simulations of their own past? Entire worlds reconstructed with such precision that the inhabitants inside those simulations would experience them as real. If that is possible even once, and if such simulations could contain conscious beings, then the number of simulated worlds might vastly outnumber the single original one. From that line of reasoning comes a provocative suggestion. Statistically, it might be more likely that we are inside a simulation than in the original base reality. Now pause. This is not a scientific conclusion. It is a philosophical argument. It does not arise from experimental measurement. It arises from extrapolation and logic. There is no laboratory device that has detected a pixel of space or a computational boundary to the universe. Still, the idea resonates because our own digital creations provide a metaphor. In a video game, a vast landscape may appear continuous. Mountains rise in the distance, rivers flow, characters move and interact, yet beneath that appearance lies code, instructions processed by hardware. The environment is rendered as needed. Details may sharpen when a player approaches and simplify when distant. The inhabitants within such a world, if conscious, might never see the underlying code. They would experience trees and skies as immediate reality. Some proponents of the simulation hypothesis suggest that unusual phenomena, unexplained anomalies, could be interpreted as glitches in the program, time slips. In this, framing might be rendering errors, a scene briefly loading the wrong texture, an overlap between different stored states. It is a compelling metaphor. But metaphors must not outrun evidence. No confirmed physical observation requires a simulation framework to explain it. Quantum mechanics, relativity, and cosmology function without invoking external programmers. The simulation hypothesis does not yet produce unique, testable predictions that distinguish it clearly from conventional physics. Still, it raises a subtle and important shift in perspective. Instead of asking whether matter is fundamental, it asks whether information might be more basic than matter. Interestingly, modern physics already hints that information plays a deep role. Black hole thermodynamics, quantum field theory, and discussions about entropy often treat information as central. But information in physics does not necessarily imply a computer running code. It refers to the structure and organization of states. The leap from informational physics to literal simulation is large, yet philosophically the idea forces humility. If reality were simulated, the rules we observe would be part of the simulation's internal logic. We would not have access to the outer layer. In such a case, asking whether time slips are real might be like asking whether a character in a novel can step outside its own chapters. Still, this framing does not grant license to attribute unexplained experiences to glitches. A glitch implies error. Error implies comparison to a baseline of correct function. Without access to that baseline, the concept of glitch remains speculative. There is also a deeper caution. The simulation hypothesis can become unfalsifiable. If every anomaly is attributed to unknown programming, the idea ceases to be scientifically useful. It becomes metaphysical speculation. And yet, as a thought experiment, it invites reflection. If reality is rendered moment by moment, the flow of time might resemble the refresh rate of a screen. Each frame follows the previous in sequence. The illusion of continuity arises from rapid updating. But this is analogy, not evidence. The more grounded lesson may be this: our intuitions about solidity and permanence are shaped by scale. At microscopic levels, matter behaves probabilistically. At cosmological scales, space-time curves. In philosophical extrapolations, reality could even be informational at its core. Time slips, within this layered view, might represent attempts by the human mind to interpret experiences that feel discontinuous. When perception stutters, whether through stress, memory distortion, or subtle neurological shifts, the metaphor of a glitch feels satisfying. It matches our technological age. But satisfaction is not confirmation. There is no measurement indicating that the universe occasionally loads the wrong decade. Still, the simulation hypothesis reminds us of something important. Our experience of reality is mediated. Your brain does not perceive raw existence. It constructs a model from sensory input. In that sense, you already live inside a kind of simulation, not cosmic code, but neural representation. The world you see is the brain's best guess at what exists beyond the skull, and sometimes that internal simulation can misalign. Not because of universal error, but because biological systems are imperfect. This insight gently brings us back toward human experience. After wandering through relativity, quantum theory, and branching worlds, we return to the mind, the interpreter of all these ideas. And as we do, another question arises. What about time slips that seem to move forward rather than backward? Stories of glimpsing architecture not yet built, of sensing events before they occur, of stepping briefly into a future that feels strangely vivid. Are these different in kind, or do they arise from the same predictive machinery that constantly simulates tomorrow within your brain? We turn next toward that question, not toward prophecy, but toward prediction, the quiet, everyday process by which your mind continually imagines what comes next. Most time-slip stories lean backward. They describe cobblestones replacing asphalt, oil lamps flickering where streetlights should stand, uniforms and carriages emerging from the present like ghosts of architecture. But occasionally the direction seems reversed. Instead of stepping into the past, a person reports glimpsing something not yet built, a skyline slightly altered, a building under construction that, at the time of the experience, did not exist, a conversation that seems to unfold before it happens. These accounts are rarer, but they follow a similar emotional pattern, a sudden shift, a sense of strangeness, a vividness that lingers. The interpretation, however, differs. Instead of history resurfacing, it feels as though tomorrow briefly revealed itself. To approach to this calmly, we must return to something familiar. Your brain is not only a recorder of past events, it is a simulator of the future, constantly. When you walk toward a door, your mind predicts how it will feel to grasp the handle. When you speak, your brain anticipates the next word before it leaves your mouth. When you plan a conversation, you rehearse possible responses in advance. Neuroscientists often describe the brain as a prediction machine. It does not wait passively for sensory information. It generates expectations and compares them to incoming data. Most of the time, prediction and perception align smoothly. You barely notice the process. But occasionally, prediction can feel unusually vivid. Imagine walking past a construction site and, without thinking deeply about it, picturing the finished building. Weeks later, when the structure is complete, you experience a strange familiarity. It feels as though you've seen it before. In truth, you have. Your brain simulated it. The difference between imagination and memory can sometimes blur. The neural circuits involved in recalling past events overlap significantly with those involved in imagining future scenarios. This overlap can create powerful sensations. There is even a phenomenon known as déjà vu that sometimes has a forward-facing counterpart, a sense of having anticipated something just before it occurs. Not in a supernatural way, but in a way that feels unusually precise. Consider this. You're about to receive a phone call. For a fleeting moment, you picture a specific friend calling. The phone rings, and it is indeed that friend. You might interpret this as premonition, but your brain constantly generates predictions based on subtle cues, recent messages, patterns of contact, time of day. When one of those predictions aligns with reality, it stands out dramatically. The countless predictions that do not align are forgotten. This selective reinforcement strengthens belief in forward glimpses. Now imagine an urban environment. You walk through a district undergoing redevelopment. Plans are posted on signs. Construction materials are visible. Architectural styles trend in certain directions. Your brain absorbs these cues. It extrapolates unconsciously. If you later experience a vivid mental image of a completed building in that space, and months afterward the finished structure resembles your image, the experience can feel uncanny, but it may simply reflect predictive modelling at work. The brain is remarkably good at forecasting patterns. There are also cases where people report dreaming of events that later occur. Dreams are fertile ground for interpretation. They combine memory fragments, emotional concerns, and random neural activity into narrative form. Given enough dreams and enough real-world events, occasional overlaps are statistically inevitable. Again, coincidence does not equal causation. But coincidence can feel profound. There is another dimension worth exploring. Under stress or emotional intensity, the brain can generate extremely vivid simulations. These simulations may feel as real as perception. If such a simulation occurs in a familiar environment, it might blend briefly with sensory input. The result could feel like a scene slightly ahead of its time. None of this requires backward-flowing causality. It does not require wormholes or branching realities reconnecting. It requires only a brain evolved to anticipate. Anticipation is survival. If early humans could predict where prey would move or where danger might arise, they survived. That predictive capacity became deeply embedded in neural architecture. In modern life, the same mechanism continues to operate. Forecasting conversations, planning routes, imagining consequences. Sometimes that forecasting becomes unusually vivid, and when vividness combines with coincidence, it can resemble foresight. This does not dismiss every forward time-slip account outright. It simply provides a grounded framework. The human mind lives slightly ahead of itself. You're always projecting a small distance into the future, adjusting expectations moment by moment. Usually, this projection remains invisible, but occasionally it may surface into awareness in a way that feels extraordinary. There is something almost beautiful about this. Instead of seeing time as a strict boundary between what is and what will be, we recognize that consciousness continually bridges that boundary through imagination. In a sense, you're always slipping forward by fractions of a second, anticipating the next word, the next step, the next breath. That is not paranormal, it is cognitive architecture. And yet, when anticipation aligns dramatically with outcome, it can feel as though tomorrow briefly opened a window. The key distinction remains. Prediction is not perception of a future event, it is the brain's best guess, shaped by pattern recognition, and while that guess can occasionally feel uncanny, it does not constitute evidence of time bending. Still, the phenomenon teaches us something important. The line between memory and imagination, between recollection and projection, is thinner than we often realize. Your experience of time is not simply moving forward like a train on tracks. It is an active construction, integrating past data and future expectation into a seamless present. When that integration falters, even slightly, the experience can feel like slipping across temporal boundaries. We have now explored backward slips, environmental hypotheses, relativistic bending, quantum symmetry, branching realities, and simulated worlds. Each idea expands perspective, but expansion must eventually settle into clarity. What do we actually know, and what remains unproven? That is where we turn next, not to extinguish wonder, but to ground it gently in evidence. We have travelled a long arc, from gardens in old cities to the curvature of space-time, from magnetic fields beneath our feet to branching universes and simulated realities. We have allowed imagination to stretch, carefully, thoughtfully, while keeping one hand anchored to evidence. Now it is time to gather the threads, not to dismiss wonder, but to ask, gently and honestly, what do we actually know? First, there is no repeatable laboratory evidence demonstrating macroscopic time travel in everyday environments. No controlled experiment has shown a person stepping into another century and returning with verifiable physical artifacts. No instruments have recorded abrupt temporal discontinuities on city streets. Science advances through reproducibility. If a phenomenon can be triggered, measured, and independently confirmed, it gains credibility. Time slips, as described in anecdotal accounts, do not meet this criterion. Second, many stories change over time. When researchers trace the earliest versions of famous cases, they often find differences from later retellings. Details become sharper, dates shift slightly, historical context grows more precise. What began as a brief moment of confusion may evolve into a richly textured narrative. This does not imply dishonesty. It reflects the nature of memory. As we discussed earlier, memory is reconstructive. Each recollection reshapes the story. Conversations with others influence interpretation. Cultural frameworks provide language for unusual experiences. A sensation once described as strange may later become a glimpse into another era, after reflection and discussion. Third, there is the absence of physical traces. In most time-slip accounts, nothing material crosses the boundary. No clothing is exchanged. No coins from the past remain in pockets. No verified recordings capture the altered environment. The world resets. If centuries truly overlapped in a physical sense, we might expect measurable anomalies, electromagnetic disturbances, gravitational fluctuations, or some detectable signature. None have been confirmed. Fourth, cultural reinforcement plays a powerful role. When a location gains a reputation for temporal anomalies, additional reports often follow. The clustering can create a feedback loop. People arrive primed to notice irregularities. Ambiguous perceptions are interpreted through the lens of existing narratives. This pattern is not unique to time slips. It appears in reports of hauntings, mysterious lights, and other extraordinary claims. Human beings share stories. Stories shape expectation. Expectation shapes perception. All of this points toward a sober conclusion. Most time-slip experiences are probably not literal crossings of temporal boundaries. Probably. That word matters. Science rarely deals in absolutes. It deals in likelihood based on evidence. Given what we know about physics, the extreme conditions required to bend time significantly, and given what we know about psychology, the malleability of memory, the power of prediction, the influence of stress, the simplest explanation for most reported time slips lies within human cognition. But caution cuts both ways. To say probably is not to say impossible. Physics is incomplete. We do not yet have a unified theory that seamlessly combines quantum mechanics and general relativity. The so-called problem of time in quantum gravity remains unresolved. At the deepest levels, our understanding of time may still be partial. Humility is essential. History reminds us that confident assumptions have been overturned before. There was a time when space and time were thought absolute. Relativity changed that. There was a time when particles were assumed to be tiny solid spheres. Quantum mechanics reshaped that picture. Yet progress in science does not come from embracing every anomaly as evidence of hidden dimensions. It comes from careful testing, skepticism, and refinement. Time slips sit in a delicate space. They are delicate, meaningful experiences for those who report them. They can feel vivid, transformative, even life-altering. Dismissing them outright risks overlooking important psychological or neurological insights, but elevating them to evidence of time travel without empirical support risks misunderstanding both physics and the mind. There is a middle path. One can acknowledge the sincerity of witnesses while recognizing the limitations of anecdote. One can remain open to the possibility that future discoveries may revise our understanding of time, while also grounding conclusions in current evidence. Perhaps the most profound lesson of this journey is not about stepping into other eras. It is about how fragile and intricate our experience of time truly is. You do not experience time as an equation. You experience it as memory, anticipation, aging, change. You feel its passage in the rhythm of days and nights, in the growth of children, in the fading of seasons. Time, as measured by atomic clocks, bends under gravity and motion by tiny fractions. Time, as lived by consciousness, stretches in boredom and contracts in joy. Both are real in their own domains. And when someone reports slipping into another era, what they have undeniably experienced is a disruption in that lived sense of time. Whether that disruption arose from memory distortion, predictive overreach, environmental factors, or something we do not yet understand, it reveals something about the human condition. We are creatures who inhabit the present, haunted by the past, reaching toward the future. Sometimes those layers blur, sometimes the boundary feels thin, but thin does not necessarily mean torn. As we prepare to close this exploration, there remains one final reflection. Even if time slips are not literal fractures in space-time, our experience of time itself remains one of the deepest mysteries in existence. Clocks measure duration, but consciousness feels it, and the gap between measurement and meaning is wide enough to hold a lifetime. And so we arrive at the quiet edge of the question, not at a dramatic revelation, not at a portal opening in the air, but at something softer, a recognition that time, even without literal slips between centuries, is stranger than it first appears. We began with stories, people walking through gardens, down city streets, into buildings that seemed to belong to another era. We traced patterns in memory. We examined environmental hypotheses. We bent time gently with relativity. We folded space-time in theory. We stepped into quantum uncertainty, branching realities, and philosophical simulations. And now, as the layers settle, something remains. Physics is not finished. General relativity describes gravity with astonishing accuracy. Quantum mechanics describes the microscopic world with equal precision. Yet the two frameworks do not fully merge. The search for a theory of quantum gravity, a unified description of space, time, and matter at the deepest scale, continues. Within that search lies what some physicists call the problem of time. In certain attempts to describe the universe at its most fundamental level, time does not appear in the equations in the way we expect. It may not be a basic ingredient of reality, but something that emerges from more primitive relationships. Emergent. That word matters. Consider temperature. You feel warmth and coldness directly. But temperature is not a fundamental particle. It arises from the collective motion of countless microscopic molecules. Remove the molecules, and temperature disappears. If time were emergent in a similar way, arising from deeper interactions, then our everyday experience of flowing moments might be like the warmth of a fire, real but not fundamental. This possibility does not confirm time slips, but it humbles certainty. The present moment feels razor sharp. The past feels solidly behind you. The future feels open and undefined. Yet, Physics suggests that these categories may be less rigid than intuition implies. Still, humility is not the same as credulity. To say that time's nature remains partly unresolved does not mean that every anomaly becomes plausible evidence of temporal fracture. Science advances slowly, carefully, with measurement and testing. And yet, even within well-established physics, there is wonder enough. Two clocks can disagree because of motion and gravity. Particles can exist as possibilities before interaction. The arrow of time may emerge from statistical conditions rather than from fundamental law. Reality may be structured in ways that defy common sense. All of this is confirmed, measured, explored. Time slips as literal crossings between eras remain unconfirmed. But the feeling of slipping, that moment when the world seems thinner, when memory and imagination blur, reveals something deeply human. Your experience of time is not a simple ticking metronome, it is layered. You carry your childhood within you. You project yourself into tomorrow. In a single conversation, you may reference decades past and years ahead. Psychologically, you're always spanning multiple temporal layers. Perhaps what we sometimes interpret as stepping into another era is the mind momentarily misplacing those layers, letting memory, expectation, and perception overlap. Or perhaps future discoveries will reshape our understanding once again, revealing subtleties we cannot yet see. The responsible stance is neither to declare absolute impossibility nor to accept extraordinary claims without evidence. It is to hold wonder and rigour together. There is a quiet beauty in that balance. You live inside a universe where time bends gently under gravity, where microscopic events defy classical intuition, where the deepest structure of reality remains partially veiled. You also live inside a brain that reconstructs the past and simulates the future with astonishing skill. Between those two, cosmic structure and neural architecture, lies your experience of now, and now is elusive. It cannot be isolated in a jar. It cannot be frozen and examined. By the time you try to grasp it, it has already shifted. In that sense, every moment is a kind of slip, not into another century, but from potential into memory. The mystery of time may not lie in stepping through invisible doorways. It may lie in understanding how a universe governed by physical laws gives rise to beings who feel duration, longing, nostalgia, anticipation. Clocks measure seconds with atomic precision, but hearts measure time in different units, in seasons of life, in relationships, in change. Time is both objective and subjective. It is both curvature in space-time and the ache of remembering. Perhaps the true fascination with time slips is not about travel at all. It's about the deep intuition that time is not as simple as it seems, and that intuition, in its own quiet way, is correct. Time is not simple. It is woven into gravity. It is entangled with entropy. It may emerge from deeper layers yet unknown. And while we have no evidence that streets open into other centuries, we do have abundant evidence that reality is more subtle than surface appearances suggest. So we end not with certainty, but with clarity. Most reported time slips are probably products of perception, memory, culture, and imagination. Yet the nature of time itself remains one of the grand open questions of physics, measured by clocks, felt by consciousness, explored by curiosity. As you rest tonight, you may notice the gentle rhythm of passing moments, breath following breath, thought following thought. Time flows, or perhaps you flow through it. Either way, the mystery remains rich enough without needing portals, and that perhaps is wonder enough.